Okay, welcome back to ICE. In this video, we're going to look at PHP Sessions. And before we get into what sessions are and how they are used, I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of common uses of PHP Sessions. Now, consider the hit page counter, right? Now this counts the number of times a page has been visited. So here you have an example. You have seen this page 0 times, hit the reload button and see this number change. So if I hit reload, notice 1. Again, so each time I hit reload, this is incremented. So it is able to remember the previous value of this, and then as I hit reload, it will take the previous value and increment it by 1. So this is a program called available here, and you can try it out as well. And if I wanted to reset this back to 0, I can run another PHP script, which is located here, reset count.php, and if I just click on this, it will reset the counter, and we will come back to this, and notice it's 6 here as before, and if I click it, it becomes 0. Right? So I've reset the page counter. So this is a PHP program, and it uses something called sessions to keep track of the current value of this, so that each time I reload the page, I'm sending a request back to the server, and when the server runs the count.php program, it will read the current value of the counter from a session variable, which we'll come to later, and will increment the value of the session variable and will show, and it will then return a page with the current value of the session variable, right? So as I increment this, each time a page is generated with the current value of the session variable incremented by 1. And this other PHP file, reset-count.php, will reset the value of the counter to 0. Right? So it will read the value of the counter on the server side and reset it to 0, so that if I reload it, it's back to 0. Now here's another use of sessions, and this is a lot more common usage for sessions. So you have a username and you have a password that you want to log into a particular website. And say if I didn't use the right password, so I type in jdoe, and suppose that's the username, and I type in hello, right, which is the wrong password, and when I log in, your username and password do not match, right? So you notice that there's an error message generated, right? And this error message is generated from the use of sessions, right? But if I log in with the right password, you notice that this is a form, right? So the username and password, when I click on login, the value that I entered for username and password will be posted to a PHP script on the server side, which will then connect to a database and verify my username and password to see if they are correct. Right? So if I log in, there's the right password, jdoe p is the password, and it's the right password I get to here, and then I can keep going from here. Notice that it records my session down here. Now this page here has a URL. So if you look at this URL, and if I copy that URL, okay, so now let's go to the page without logging in. Say I'm doing it on the Chrome browser, and I'm trying to go to this page without logging in. And you notice that it asks me to log in first, right? Because it checks, first of all, a value in a session variable to see if I've logged in. And if I haven't logged in, it's going to give me this error message. So I have to, first of all, log in first. So I come back to this page, I log in with the right username and password, and then I'm fine. Right? And then from then onwards, even if the same URL is then available here, right? So because I have logged in, I can see that page. So we have looked at two examples. One is a page counter, and the other is a login. So and the other is a login feature where you can remember that you have logged in, And because you have logged in, you can see that page. But if you haven't logged in, you cannot see the contents of that page. And all that have been implemented using PHP Sessions. So what are PHP Sessions? Well, we have seen that demo, the counter. And if you look at that PHP program, count.php, it's a very short program, right? And this is what it looks like. First of all, we need to be able to access the session variables. So remember, a session is actually implemented using cookies. So the underlying mechanism is a cookie mechanism when sessions are used. So to keep track, for instance, that a user is logged in, that information is kept on a cookie in the browser side, and that cookie is set by a set cookie command from the server side. So set cookie commands from the server get sent to the browser, which then updates the cookie on the client side. Keep in mind that sessions are implemented using the cookie mechanism. But when we deal with sessions, we just need to know what PHP function calls to use, and we don't really have to worry how it's actually implemented. So if you look at count.php, in order to access what is called the $_session variables, right? So it's the session $_session array is actually an array of session variables which can be used to keep state information. For example, to record that the user is logged in successfully, to record whether the user is logged in or not, to record the value of a counter. So where is that value of the counter stored? Well, is one of the elements in the $_session variable. So how do you get access to the $_session variable? Well, we first have to call this PHP function session_start. So whenever you want to access the $_session variable, you have to call session_start first. So in this program, count.php, I call session_start, and then first of all, I check whether this variable is set or not. $_session count, right? Is this set? And if it is not set, I set it to 0. So this is an initialization. So the first time a page is visited, this is not set, right? This is not set. And then because it's not set, it will then go into this line and it will set $_session count to be 0. And that's why you saw earlier that you've seen this page 0 times the first. Of course, you can set it to 1 if you wanted to. Else, that means if it is already set, that means there's already a value in $_session count. If $_session count already has a value, that means it has been set previously. In other words, the page has been visited before, and $_session count would have kept the number of times the page has been visited before. So if that was the case, then not is set will be false, right? Because it has been set, and we'll come here and we'll increment the counter. And then this bit here will then print out the value of the counter. Will generate the page that you saw just now. Hello visitor, you have seen this page so many number of times in this session. Right? And each time you reload, this PHP script will be rerun. Right? And that's why this counter will be incremented, because each time you rerun this script, the value of $_session count is incremented. Of course, you notice that for descriptive reasons, I have called this count, right? So in fact, $_session is a rather flexible kind of array, right? Instead of calling it count, I can use counter, I can use my count, as long as I'm consistent. And then you can run another program called reset count to reset it. So, and what does reset count.php look like? It's just a 3-line program. Again, because we're going to access the session variables, we have to call session start. Now, this is a bit misleading, right? Because we're not starting a session. We have already started the session. But just to remember that every time you want to access the $_session variable, we have to call session start, right? And then in this case, it just destroys all the session variables. It does not just set $_session count to be 0. You could do that if you wanted to. Instead of having this line, you can write $_session count equals to 0. But in this case, it does more than that. It destroys the session. So it initializes the value of $_session. Right? The entire array is actually wiped out or initialized. And then it echoes this statement, count reset. Okay, and you have also looked at this idea, right, of logging in and verifying logging in by using this session variable mechanism. And you can kind of get an idea of sessions relate to logging in, right? Because if you enter the right username and password, you can remember that by setting the value of the $_session array, right? Once you set a value there, you can record the fact that the user has logged in successfully, and then from then onwards you can show any page. And if you log out, then you can destroy the session, right? And this is how this mechanism works. So I've already showed you these pages, right? And if you try to bypass a page, right, that means when you log in, you will go to a particular page, and if you try to access that page without logging in successfully, it wouldn't succeed, because it will first check a value in the $session variable to see whether login was successful before displaying that page. So here's a picture of what has gone on just now. Here's the login page, and if you successfully authenticated, then you'll be shown that page where you can order pizza, right, as you have seen earlier. So you enter the form details, username and password. That gets sent to a PHP program called authenticate.php, and processing is then done, and if it's invalid, it shows an error message and shows the username login page back to the user. But if the login is valid, then it goes to order pizza. Only if you log in successfully, then you can see this page, order pizza.php. But what if you try to see this page without logging in successfully, right? So you just type the URL of this page. If somehow you were able to find out the URL of this page, suppose you type this into the browser directly, would you be able to then see this page without logging in? Right, so you should not be able to see it. So how can you prevent this from happening, right? So the idea here is that only if the user has logged in successfully with the right username and password, then the fact that the user has logged in successfully is recorded using a $_session variable. And then if the user then wants to see order pizza, the user then can do so. So let's look at how it works, right? Whatever that's typed into the form, the username and password, is posted to this PHP program, right? So this PHP program on the server side, authenticate.php, is going to receive the username and the password that has been typed into this form, and it will do the authentication. We won't look at the code here, but you can actually check this. It will look into authenticate.php, check it against the MySQL database to determine whether it is the right username and password, and if it is right, it will then set the value of $session login to be true, right? And it will set the value of $_session login to be 1, right? But if it is not successful, it will set the value of $_session login to be 0, right? So after authenticate.php is run, this is then executed, and it says that again you have to use session start here because it's going to make use of the $_session variable. So before you can make use of $_session variable or this $_session array, you have to call session_start first. So it checks whether it's set and whether the login or failed or not, right? So if it equals to 0, that means it has failed. Then it will show an error message and then prompt the user to fill in the username and password again. And this is what authenticate.php looks like, right? So it will, the username and password that is sent, right? Because it's sent using the post method, it will be stored in the $_post variable, right? And you dereference it by the name of the field, username and password, which corresponds to the name of the field, username and password here. So if you change this to username 1 or password 1, then this will be username 1 and this will be password 1, right? And then you have an SQL statement which is going to query the MySQL database for the username and the corresponding password, the matching password. So there's a bit of code here inside this other connect2.db PHP program, and but we won't look at it here, but just imagine that there's some code here to connect to the database, and then it forms the connection and then actually connects to it and then issues that query, $query, which is defined here. So it's a select query which is going to query the database for the given username password pair and then closes the database. And this one will then determine the number of rows in the result of this MySQL query. And if the result is 0, you can imagine that means that given username password instance doesn't exist, right? If its result is 0, it will be false. So you will jump in here, and again you use session start because you want to look at the values of the $_session variable, and you assign that value to be 0, right? So this is the case where login has failed. So you will set $_session login to have the value 0, and then header is to redirect the browser, right? So it will send this header information back to the browser, and the browser will then retrieve index.php. So this is a redirection, if you like, and then it will exit. So the browser will then, on receiving this header, the browser will then retrieve index.php. It will ask for index.php from the server, right? So remember, at this point, $_session login has been set to 0. So we go back to the previous page, and now the server is going to run index.php and send the contents of send the output of running index.php back to the client. What will happen? Right? So you notice that this is index.php. So when it runs it, remember that $_session login has just been set to 0. So hence the error message will be shown, and then the user is prompted to enter username and password again. But if the number of rows in the result was not 0, it was 1. In other words, this instance of username password matches. So it is valid, in other words, because it matches, is found in the database, and of course there should only be at most one result, right? But if the result of this was 1, the number of rows is 1, 1 is equivalent to true, then it will go into this part of the if statement. Again, you will do a session start, and this time $_session login will be 1. And we also record the username that has been successfully used to log in. And we store it in the variable $_session username. And then we redirect the user to the order pizza page. The user can then now see this page successfully. And order pizza is then that particular page, right, which allows the user to enter information to order a pizza. So the idea here is to add conditions for displaying the protected content, and only if the session variable flag is set to true will contents be displayed, and set the flag to true only when the login is valid. So that's the technique that you use to protect the contents. Right? So in order pizza.php, we first call session start to gain access to the $_session variable. We first check whether the value of $_session login is 1, right? And if it is indeed 1, then we actually display the form, and that's it. But you notice that it is only equals to 1 when the result of this is true, right? So if this was 1, that means the username and password entered previously was correct, and then it will display the form, right? But if the username and password was incorrect and the person has not logged in, then the value of $_session login will be 0. And if it was 0, you notice that if $_session login has a value 0, this if condition will be false and the form will not be displayed. So it's using a bit of PHP to enclose this form to protect this form from being displayed, right? So you notice that this part of the page is only displayed if this condition is true, right? So this is the start of the if and this is the end of the if. So it's an interesting way to enclose this block within an if statement, the start of the if statement and the condition, and that's the end of the if statement. You can go to the manual and look at how session variables are actually implemented, right? So you notice you can do all the session programming, managing user login, logout, and page counters without worrying about how they're actually implemented. But if you wanted to know how it is actually implemented, well, sessions are actually implemented using cookies, right? And each session is identified by means of a PHP session ID, right? And this session ID is unique depending on the time of day, depending on the remote IP address, and there's a hashing function that generates a unique ID based on all that information. And so every session can be identified uniquely. So if someone logs in, it starts a session with the server and no one else can copy that ID or reuse that ID and intervene with that session. Okay, so but we won't go into details here about how exactly sessions have been implemented using cookies, but you know about cookies, you know about sessions, and if you're interested, you can look into further details of this.